From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, coming to you once again from Mumbai, India. And I'm joined as usual by my co-host, David Feldman. David, where are you coming to us from today?
New York City.
New York City. And, of course, the man of the hour, as always, Ralph Nader, coming to us from Washington, D.C. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, Steve and David.
We're going to take a Facebook question that is kind of in the news right now. This is from Ryan Morris. Ralph, Ryan Morris wants to know, if you were president, and assuming you had the power, would you give Guantanamo back to Cuba?
The short answer is yes. Guantanamo, that area in the eastern part of Cuba, was seized by the United States during the Spanish-American War, an imperialist war that also made us acquire, in a very bloody takeover, the Philippines from Spain. And so this was an enclave in Cuba. And after 9/11, it was the go-to prison for alleged terrorists. At the peak, Guantanamo had about 780 prisoners, miscalled detainees. And the vast majority of them were simply victims of bounty hunters in Afghanistan, Pakistan, elsewhere, who turned them over for money to intermediaries who then turned them over to the U.S. because the U.S. wanted to show under George W. Bush that they were catching terrorist suspects. They flew them to Guantanamo, and there the nightmare started. They were never charged. They were never tried. They were mistreated. Some would say they were tortured. They were force-fed when they went on fasts, put in cages like animals. And a lot of sources, including the lawyers who went down there from New York and with the help of Yale Law School Clinic and took these cases, they all agreed that the vast majority were totally innocent. They weren't even at the stage of being temporary suspects. And as the years went by, President Bush acknowledged orally that he wanted to close Guantanamo and close the prison there, not give it back to Cuba. And then President Obama campaigned on the same mission, that he wanted to close Guantanamo prison, and he wanted to do it fast. We thought it would happen in 2009, but it continued. And during the years, 4 government departments, like the Department of Homeland Security, cleared dozens of these so-called suspects who were innocent from the get-go. But they stayed in jail and were never released year after year because they say, well, the government says they don't know where they can be released to. Well, now we've learned that there are still 127 political prisoners. There are a few, maybe a dozen real hardcore suspects who were involved in violent action. They were shipped to Guantanamo knowing that. The cost to the taxpayer is $3 million per prison a year. $3 million a year. If they put them in maximum security prisons in the U.S., the cost would be $70,000 a year. It's a human rights violation. It's an international law violation. It's one of the chief embarrassments of the U.S. in the third world. It is a provocation to third world fighters, and it still goes on. Now, a few were just released. A handful, less than a half dozen, went to Uruguay, and there are still about 125 there. I suspect that at one time, and this requires verification, that there were probably more political prisoners by the U.S. in Guantanamo than Castro had in his prisons. How's that for a commentary?
Wow.
And this is a breakdown in our legal system. They wanted to put them in Guantanamo for a number of reasons. And one is to deal with them outside the requirements of due process under the U.S. Constitution. And so it is time to close the prison and send that territory back to Cuba. When I interviewed Fidel Castro in 2002, he mentioned that every year he gets a check from the U.S. government for the rent that was agreed upon over 100 years ago that the U.S. would pay for leasing Guantanamo. I think the rent now is up to $4,700 a year. Quite a bargain. But Castro opened figuratively a drawer in his desk and said, I always take this check and put it in the drawer and never cash it because I think their occupation of Guantanamo is illegal. So that's the story, and that's the answer to Ryan Morris's question.
And we're not going to get our cleaning deposit back either.
After 6 months, they may not cash it in the U.S. Who knows?
Yes.
Well, why don't we introduce our guest, Professor Edgar Cahn. We could spend practically the entire hour just reciting Professor Edgar Cahn's resume. It is a long and distinguished one. In a nutshell, Professor Cahn is an attorney and a PhD and an incredibly innovative and original legal thinker. Like Ralph, his public career started in the mid-'60s. He was speechwriter and counsel for Robert F. Kennedy. He and his wife, Jean Camper Cahn, co-authored an article in the Yale Law Review entitled The War on Poverty, A Civilian Perspective, about government-sponsored legal services for the poor, which formed the basis for the Train Lawyers to Practice Poverty Law. They then came up with the idea of time dollars and time banking. Ralph, please welcome to the show your friend and fellow traveler, Professor Edgar Cahn.
You're welcome, Edgar. Actually, that Law Journal article was the basis for legislation in Congress, and Edgar and Jean got the bill that established Legal Services Corporation, which now employs well over 4,000 legal services attorneys that provide free legal services for millions of poor people in this country. Just one of Edgar and Jean's achievements. Another one was that they started Antioch Law School. They weren't satisfied with the way law students were educated or trained, and they wanted a law school that would train lawyers who went out and represented the people for a change, not just corporations or other large institutions. Edgar, it's so hard to determine where to start here, but let me start with a book that's in my hands now. It's called No More Throwaway People, The Co-Production Imperative by you, Edgar S. Cahn. And although I know you want to go into, and this is a really dynamic concept, what you call the Midas monoculture in our country, which is another way that people have been brainwashed into evaluating everything that we do as a community and as a country by economic yardsticks of profit, etc. And you have this concept that you've developed, you've spoken about it at Yale Law School recently and elsewhere. But why don't you start with the way you wrote this book, No More Throwaway People, based on your experience? Because I think this book, which came out in 2000, as current as it was then, is the significant, most important book on poverty I've ever read. And I've read a lot of books. No More Throwaway People. Take it from there, Edgar.
Well, there's a part of the economy that's not part of the GDP, Ralph. It's something called home, family, household, neighborhood, community, civil society. It doesn't really do anything very important. It just raises children, keeps families together, makes neighborhoods vibrant, holds officials accountable, turns out voters for the election, fights for social justice, was responsible for apartheid going down, for the demonstrations that led to us finally getting past separate but equal, and maybe tries to keep the planet sustainable, but nothing of importance to the GDP. And what I realized was that that's an economy that we need rebuilding. That's the economy that really does the work of producing the kinds of communities, the kinds of citizens, the workforce we need, and the conditions under which democracy works. The other thing I realized was that none of the work that happens in community that I call real work, not none of it, but a lot of it never gets either valued or even noticed. Yes, there are volunteers who are a sort of labor force for the nonprofit world, but the real work that the feminists have identified has been primarily done by women, but not exclusively. It's now increasingly done by kids. But that the work that really produces the kind of society we want, there's no valuing of it, because who wants to value simply helping somebody? Who wants to value providing companionship for a senior? Who wants to pay for demonstrations that the officials are not doing what they promised to do? or who wants to pay for recycling. That's all supposed to be done somehow invisibly. And I decided that to deal with the major injustices that I see still going on, the major disparities, we needed a different medium of exchange, and we needed a different relationship between the people whom we define as clients and the people whom we define as co-equals. Let me give you an example. My law school represents kids who have reading problems, and we represent maybe 20 to 30 a year in trying to get them special education services so that they
Your
can
law
deal
school
with
is what, Edgar?
the University of the District of Columbia. It is now the law school of the nation's capital. Grew out of Antioch, where all students were required to live the first 6 weeks with the clients in order to be effective and have networks and be able to do the work that they need to do. It's based in poor neighborhoods, and it's the only law school where every student, 100%, get 2 semesters of work representing clients. We had the strange notion, Ralph, that wouldn't it be nice when you graduated law school if you were actually competent to help another human being? That was viewed as revolutionary and anti-intellectual back when we started it. Now it's pervasive. But what we realized was that you may save 20 to 30 kids through a special ed litigation, but what would really make a difference is if all the kids learned how to read by 3rd grade. So I went into 27 schools in Chicago and organized unemployed teachers. They were called 7th graders to help the 3rd graders with the alphabet and basic reading. And suddenly test scores went up, truancy went down, the fights at school time went down, at school lunch went down, and schools got off academic probation by enlisting the 7th graders to help the 3rd graders. We did the same in a little town called New York City, visiting nurse service, and it's now been taken over by the Archdiocese, ArchCare, got well elderly people to provide companionship and errands, and some teams did home repair for seniors to keep them out of nursing homes because they didn't want to go into nursing homes simply because of a disability. And that saved millions of dollars, and there were, in fact, at least 1 million hours that have been registered in people helping people. And I thought, well, if that's the kind of labor we really need, then why don't we begin to value it? And then I looked at money. There's never enough money, even in the programs that we fund and that the foundations fund and that the government funds. There's never enough money to get down to the community and pay all the 7th graders to help all the 3rd graders, or all the seniors who are able to get around to help the other seniors who are disabled, or all the families that have kids who may be disabled or bipolar or schizophrenic or have autism to enable them to function as an extended family. But there's an infinite number of what I call time credits because we all use hours, and so I created a currency that consists of hours, where every hour is 1 time credit. And every hour that you give spending helping somebody else earns you a credit and debits them, and then they have to pay it back by helping somebody else. So it sends out ripple effects that really begin to rebuild the community. You know, one of the sad things is we don't know our neighbors. We know maybe their name. We've known neighbors, I'm sure, for 4 or 5 years. We go out on the street and we say something really personal to them, like, do you think it will rain tomorrow, or who's going to win the game? But we have no clue as to what they know how to do or what they would like to do for somebody else, or when they're available and when they're not. So I decided, why not create another kind of currency? Because when you change a currency, you change the dynamics that flow from that currency. Now, most people know about another currency we use called grades and academic credits. And we know if you change the nature of that currency from 4 to 4.0 from pass-fail, you change what may be a collective kind of working together, particularly if you grade people for teamwork. Then if you get a 4.0, which has people competing for 1/100th of a decimal point to get an advantage over somebody else. So when you create another kind of currency, you create a different dynamic. And that's what I created. And I said, you know, every human being has something to offer. I've not met a household where most of the members of the household, except those maybe with Alzheimer's, could do something for somebody else. I've seen a woman in a wheelchair, say, and who is actually on oxygen, helping a returned veteran train seeing eye dogs to be around people in wheelchairs. I've seen a person who was a paraplegic teaching 7 kids how to play chess and beating them all on 7 boards. So I've yet to find a human being who can't help another human being in some way. And I think that the economy we need to build is an economy based on the labor of helping each other and giving to each other what we can.
And that's the time dollar.
And we call it time dollars or time banking, and the website is timebanks.org, and people can read about it. And we've just come out, Ralph, with a brand new generation of software called Community Weaver. It'll be available on smartphones and tablets, so one can go around communities, those who are not afraid of computers and feel comfortable, and they can do the matching in people's homes, and they can set up the appointments, and they can record the hours.
See, the way it would work is really quite fascinating, because Edgar has had these projects in Miami and all over the country in neighborhoods where people use what they all have, which is time, and they're all equal. So here's a simple example. Let's say you have a lawyer and her spouse in a home. They're a little bit advanced in age, and they need their sidewalk shoveled in the winter and their lawn cut in the summer. And so in the Time Dollar program, which can be run by a church, it can be run by a community college, all at computers, they basically get a teenager who cuts the grass, shovels the snow, but the teenager needs something in return. The teenager needs to be tutored. And so they just exchange time dollars. Let's say the youngster spends 10 hours puttering around the home, doing things that they can't do because of their age, and the lawyer and spouse will tutor that teenager for 10 hours. In other words, instead of dollars, it's time exchange. And the beauty of it is, A, it's tax exempt. Edgar's made sure that the IRS has issued a determination. There's no taxation for these kinds of exchanges. And 2, how about this one? A teenager's hour is equal to a lawyer's hour when you have time dollar exchanges. Give us an idea of how this plays out in the rest of your book, No More Throwaway People, and the whole concept of co-production. Listen to this one.
Well, what we're saying under the concept of co-production is that if we keep relegating people whom we're helping to the status of consumer only, your job is to consume my services as a lawyer, my services as a doctor, my services as a counselor, what we find is that may be helpful, but it's limited, and what we've never looked at the person to say is, what could you do for somebody else? So we have large agencies serving thousands and millions of people, but they're basically saying, your job is to consume my services. Your job is not to help build the community that we both live in together. So what I've done in working with those agencies is to say, wouldn't you be able to fulfill your mission more effectively if you asked the people who were your clients to pay it back by paying forward by participating in the time bank? And the time bank can take on a project. In Oakland, where they were dealing with violence, they provided safe escort to kids going to school, and they set up events so people began to know each other and trust each other. And what had been a black church became a joint black-Hispanic church, and the shootings between them stopped. What happens elsewhere is that I've used this currency to run the youth court here in D.C., where kids were given jurisdiction over minor offenses by other kids. So they constituted a court, and close to 70% at one point, all nonviolent crimes by teenagers were coming before juries of teenagers with a law student presiding as the judge. And the teenagers had the power given them by the Superior Court to sentence a kid to up to 90 hours of community service, to pay back or restitution, to an apology. And then also they sentenced them to serve on the jury for up to 9 weeks. So it was not the good kids judging the bad kids. It was true peer justice. They reduced recidivism to 6% from well over 34%. And these were the bad kids doing more, frankly, for the rule of law than law students were doing.
This is an example of what you've done around the country. And the time dollar isn't just A helps B and B helps A. It could be A helps B, B helps C, C helps D, and D helps A. That's what your software facilitates. And you're also taking this internationally. I don't know whether you've done anything in India on this, but you told me you just came back recently from Britain or Ireland. Can you describe the international interest in the time dollar concept?
Well, it's now spread to 38 countries. We just got word that it's starting up in China, and it's how they're dealing with elder care in some villages there. In Great Britain, it gets the attention of the House of Lords and Commons, and it's been debated, and the Home Office has sponsored it all over Great Britain. I saw that happen in Northern Ireland, and in Wales it's being used to really revive cities and towns that went almost defunct when the coal mines were closed as part of what Thatcher did. And so what we're seeing is real revitalization of communities because people want to be able to help. They want to feel that they are making a difference. But if the only work that's valued is work that you can be paid for, then this is not work that the market is willing to pay for. And this brought me back to a realization at the London School of Economics about the way that money worked. And we all know that money defines value by price. So if a thing is scarce, the price is high. If a thing is more abundant, it's cheaper. If it's really abundant, it's either dirt cheap or worthless. And I suddenly realized that meant being a human being doing what human beings can do is worthless. We have a monetary system that has devalued all the caring, all the mentoring, all the civic engagement that people as citizens and as human beings can do. And I thought, no, we need another currency that does what money doesn't try to do and what money can't do, which is to value the kind of giving that builds families and communities and makes democracy work and fights for social justice.
And you have in your chapter in the book, you have a chapter that says the dark side of the force, the external costs of money. And you have a chapter heading called Money, Our Drug of Choice. Now, just to clarify what you're saying, Edgar, what you're saying is that a lot of the things in our culture, in all cultures, which are done as gifts, mothers, fathers raising children, neighbors helping each other, intergenerational assistance, civic activity for justice, all of these super important things that really shape a civilization are not part of the market economy. Therefore, they are not judged by money. You made a lot of money this year. You got rich last year. And as a result, they are excluded from the dominant yardstick that controls our lives, which is the monetary yardstick. And I use the word the monetization of politics, which is politicians for sale or for rent when they run for election to contributors from special interests. But you've just come up with a really brilliant phrase, I think, that even clarifies this concept more. We so grow up looking at everything measured by money that we cannot clarify the different parts of our society that are not measured by money and therefore devalued, low status, not considered ambitious, etc. And the phrase, David and Steve, that he is using and he's going to develop further is the Midas monoculture. So when Gene and Edgar started the Legal Services Corporation to provide legal services for poor people, there is no contribution by the poor people to expand the mission of legal services in terms of spending some time with their neighborhood. So why don't you explain how liberating this concept is, Edgar, in terms of developing new and powerful and prestigious yardsticks to encourage non-monetized activity, which of course is central to our whole concept of justice, well-being, and a civilized society.
All of us, Ralph, are besieged by emails for 1,000 good causes, and we're spread thin. And I thought, what would it take to go upstream? They talk about the babies whom you're rescuing downstream, but who's throwing the babies, into the water upstream? And when I went to that, I thought, we've all become brainwashed into thinking in terms of money, that this is the equivalent of a monoculture. And I thought, well, what does agriculture teach us about monoculture? But first let me say, fixation with money has invaded every domain. With lawyers now, it's a calling. You're an officer of the court. It's the bottom line and billable hours. Doctors, you get 6 minutes per patient and you're on a treadmill. Nonprofits compete with every other nonprofit for grants and government contracts and forget that you're all in the business of trying to help make society work. In field after field, I have seen preoccupation with money erode the core values of the nonprofit world. We've certainly seen it erode the guts of democracy in terms of Citizens United and in terms of the impact of money. And increasingly, it's been a preoccupation that says we don't have to keep the planet sustainable. We just have to see how much profit we can make out of it this year, and we don't really care about the externalities. And I thought that monoculture has become an intellectual prison that affects every discipline and every profession. Schools are now no longer places for faculty. They've, in effect, digitized everything, and the faculty have now become adjunct professors doing piecework, basically. So you see it invading every domain. And I thought, what do we learn in agriculture? And in agriculture, we learned that if you grow a monocrop, let's say like wheat or corn, and I've got nothing against wheat or corn, but if you only grow one crop, certain things happen. One is that the soil becomes depleted. The second is when that crop goes down, everything goes down. And third, if you have a monocrop, then the pests know where to come to get their cut. Well, I thought that looks suspiciously like money. We know that people are so busy working and so busy trying to make the next paycheck that they've forgotten about family, they've forgotten about kids, they've forgotten about voting, and they've forgotten about the things that they care about most. We know, too, that when that monocrop goes down, we saw in 2008 that it took everything down with it. And third, we know from Occupy Wall Street where the pests are lodged, who come and take their cut of the crop or with reliability. And I thought, well, what have the folks in agriculture learned that we can emulate? And I thought, well, they've learned, one, that you need to plant diverse crops. And for that, I think you need alternative kinds of currency, and time banking is one. But also they've learned that sometimes you let the land go fallow, and those are the sabbaticals and, in effect, going for higher education and taking time out. We've learned it in corporate social responsibility. That's the equivalent of crop rotation, where you're allowed as an employee to do a certain amount of work. That's the equivalent of service learning. That's a kind of crop rotation. We've learned that organic farming is something that the folks dealing with monocrops deal with, and the equivalent of that is the permaculture movement and the buy local movement. And so we're beginning to understand that if we borrow from what they've learned about monocrops and monoculture in agriculture, we can begin to say, what is it going to take to build the kind of ecosystem that our species needs? And there's nothing against money per se, but when money becomes the sole crop and the sole fixation, we've got a problem. And one of those problems was highlighted recently by Piketty in his book, where he wrote that when the rate of return on capital exceeds the rate of growth of output and income, it generates arbitrary and unsustainable inequalities that radically undermine the values on which the democratic societies are based. Well, that's what we've got, and until we begin to deal with the magnitude of the way in which our preoccupation with money overwhelms everything else, we're in trouble. There's a recent book by Peter Barnes that notes the global value of financial derivatives in 2012 was $687 trillion compared to a total world GDP of only $72 trillion. The total value of foreign exchange transactions in 2010 was $1.5 quadrillion. Of that amount, only 1.5% was used to pay for real goods. The rest was currency speculation. So I'm hoping that, thinking of this in terms of how do we break out of a monoculture. I call it a Midas monoculture because we know that as Midas got what he asked for, everything turned to gold, including all the food he was trying to eat and including his own daughter. We need to break out of that spell because I think we're under the cast of a Midas spell, and that Midas spell takes the form of a monoculture.
Before we have Steve and David ask you a question, can you give the website where people can connect? Because this is often so new to people, because your accomplishments on the ground from your thinking behind your desk very rarely makes the national TV, radio, news, newspapers. It's a reflection of exactly what you're saying, so they may not be fully able to absorb concretely what you're suggesting. So why don't you give the website where they can develop their thoughts further?
Yeah, we don't have a major bank robbery of the time banks, so there's no headlines of people just doing good. The website is timebanks.org, and there's another site that I use to do blogs called coreeconomy.org, because I think that this is an area where we need to start sharing creative thinking. The creativity that's out there is incredible. So go to timebanks.org or coreeconomy.org. Other radical idea that I would share with you, Ralph, on this is I am trying to create an obligation on the part of officials to use knowledge. Now, I know that's an absurd idea, but I think that if we got officials to stop doing what they know doesn't work and start doing what they know does work and it would save money, they are the only people, officials are the only people who are immune and insulated from an obligation to use knowledge. For lawyers and doctors, it's malpractice. For others, it's simply gross negligence or negligence. But for officials, it's discretion and immunity from suit that protects them. And I think we need to begin asking, how do we create a legally enforceable obligation to use knowledge, at least where refusal to do so perpetuates the kind of disparity we see in prisons and juvenile justice and child welfare.
That'd be a great congressional hearing, Edgar. Steve or David, do you have a question for Professor Cahn?
Yeah, Professor, I want to thank Ralph on behalf of our listeners for bringing Professor Cahn on. You were a counsel to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, and you were a speechwriter for Robert F. Kennedy, who, before he was assassinated, gave a speech about the gross national product. He said it measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile, and it tells us everything about America except why we are proud that we are Americans.
Mm-hmm.
What would have happened if Robert F. Kennedy were not one of the 1.4 million Americans who died from gunfire since 1968?
Well, I think we would have seen a different vision of what's possible. What I see now is a politics of fear. I don't trust anybody, and that's both paralyzing and polarizing, so that the whole philosophy that I saw him, and he grew into it, he didn't start there, but he grew into, I think, an understanding that if we didn't begin to learn how to reach out to each other across lines, learn how to trust, even when trust involves risk, that what he was saying was we have to appeal to and count on our better selves. All of us have a small self. All of us can get scared and frightened. But we have to reach out. And have you ever actually smiled at the cashier behind the supermarket counter and seen them respond? We don't treat each other as human beings. And we've been told that you cannot trust a stranger. Well, and that we need a police check on everybody. Well, the species would not have gotten very far before you had your first date. You had to get a police check and a criminal record check on your date. As a species, we've evolved by reaching out to each other and learning how to reach out to each other, and I think we've got to start all over again. I think the Internet provides one tool, and Facebook and social media, but I like real friends, not virtual friends, and that's what time banking really has been able to create.
the currency of exchanging activities through hours, exchanging hours.
And it takes an infrastructure, so the organizations that are funded to address these problems, they need to do what Eleanor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize winner, said. They need to turn consumers from passive consumers into co-workers and co-producers. I don't think you can do that with money, because money is all about price, and price is all about who's better, who's worth more. I think you have to do it with a currency that celebrates equality and that celebrates the best in each of us.
Steve, you have a question?
Yeah, Professor Cahn, just on a practical level for our listeners. Now, we've heard all of this, and say I'm listening to this, and I say, I have some skills, and I want to join a time bank, and I'm in Chardon, Ohio, which is my hometown, 30 miles outside of Cleveland. How do I find a time bank near me? How do I get involved?
Well, do you know where Kent is? Kent, Ohio. Kent, yes. Ohio is very near Cleveland, and they're reaching out to create time banks all over. If you go to our website, you'll get a directory of time banks. But in Kent, Ohio, one woman, Abby Greer, has created a time bank with 700 members, and they're averaging 44 transactions a day. It's in fact reviving that whole community, and it's reaching out to rural areas. Here in Washington, D.C., I can tell you one thing that I'm hoping to start actually in the next month, which is respite for caregivers. The number of caregivers for the elderly, the number of caregivers for people with disability are huge, and as a matter of morality and caring, they are really imprisoned 24/7 by those caregiving responsibilities. All of us could spare 2 or 3 hours sometime during the week, once or twice a month, to provide them with a chance to get out and live fuller lives. And I think we'll be using time banking to try and mount that kind of campaign, Ralph.
Do you think that these time banks, are they generally older people and younger people, or is the profile of a time banker across all ages in your experience?
About between 40 and 50% of them are older, but then there's a sprinkling. A project like the Youth Court, a project like peer tutoring, would be frankly limited to the kids. So you can use a currency to run a program that's targeted, as well as use it to set up what I'll call a neighbor-to-neighbor model. And that's why it invites creativity. We've started one, for instance, here in D.C. for people coming back from prison, and they call themselves the Homecomers Academy because they didn't want to be called ex-cons, and they wanted to be thought of as students. And they get up every morning at 6:30 to provide safe passage to kids in Wards 7 and 8 across gang territory. So you can use it for specialized groups. There's other groups using it to deal with folks who have HIV and AIDS and are affected. But what's beautiful is that there's a sense of shared value and a sense that we can trust each other and that we can build a new kind of extended family.
So I think, Steve, any group can start it anywhere in the country. It could be a nonprofit charity. It could be a community college. It could be a church, a neighborhood association, or just a brand new collection of neighborhoods and people who want to do it. So I'm glad you asked that question, because you don't have to wait for anybody. That's the whole essence of what Edgar is proposing. It's self-starting and self-executing.
Yeah, you don't need permission.
Great.
And you can go to timebanks.org, I imagine, and sort of get a template for how to get started and how to get people signed up.
Yeah, and if somehow you need to know more, my email address is yeswecan@aol.com. I have an attitude.
You came up with that before somebody else. Somebody else I remember used that. Does anybody remember who else used Yes We Can?
Cesar Chavez.
Actually, I got it from Cesar Chavez when I trademarked his eagle. His motto was Si se puede, and his way of repaying me was, he said, Edgar, you can have the English version. So it dates back to that work with Cesar.
Wow.
Nice story. Thank you very much, Edgar. We'll continue this sometime later in the year when we see what kind of response we get. And I hope the listeners will call up their local media and say, why don't you do a feature on the time dollar? And maybe that'll stimulate groups in your community to start a time dollar. Call up your radio station, your TV. This is an issue that interests everybody. everybody. This is not some comment on a long-distance asteroid in 25 years, even though that may be very significant. This is right down where people live, work, raise their families, and they need this kind of help, and they feel good about getting it and then giving back. Similar help in terms of time, dollar, hours. And it is amazing that this isn't all over the media years ago. Why do you think that's so, Edgar?
Well, I think, one, there's a huge industry that says you're not okay, but you could be okay if you bought this toothpaste or this deodorant or these pairs of clothes. So that you're bucking, in some sense, the whole marketing strategy that makes things seem worthwhile, and that people have now come to identify their status with what they have, the stuff they have. And the value of time banking starts by really celebrating what kind of a human being you are, and then only secondarily says, and oh, by the way, if you're that kind of human being, you can get help from somebody else. I think, too, that when I originally created it, the idea that you could have other currencies was strange, and I think now that we have the internet and Facebook and
Bitcoin
and Bitcoin and a whole new generation, that the idea that one can create another kind of money that does different things, I think we're going to be helped by two things, and I didn't talk about one of them. One thing that's going to help us is basically the baby boomers. They're aging at the rate of 10,000 a day, every day for the next 17 years. And that's going to create a group of people who are going to be wondering what to do with the next chunk of their lives. The other thing is, in New Zealand, Ralph, I didn't talk about this, it was the earthquake that triggered, it was time banking that enabled them to deal with the earthquake. In New Zealand, I got reports, an earthquake hit in Littleton, and what they found was that it was because they had an operating time bank that the firemen would go into a building, but they would take out the precious possessions, and a line of people earning time credits would then bring the stuff out. They were invaded by hordes of volunteers who wanted to help, and the time bank knew how to use that in a way that nobody else did. They had seniors who had lost everything, and they needed consolation. They ran out of hotel rooms to put people up in, and time bankers took them up in their houses. They needed small places, markets, and places where people could gather, and the time bank folks sort of set up stalls and provided the kind of sort of community-based gathering places and staffed them. And so what they found was that this gave that community the resilience it needed to come back from that earthquake, because it enabled everybody to connect with everybody in a way that called on their best. And I think that as we deal with global warming and floods and hurricanes and tornadoes and tragedies, that we need that resilience, and that we need to build it into our civic infrastructure as simply a smart way to have that capacity.
It's a great example because it opens up a whole new world globally for two-way volunteer exchanges that continue after the disaster or the particular crisis is passed. Edgar, thank you again. We'll have chapter 2 coming up.
Okay, this was a joy. Thanks so much, Ralph.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Thank you, sir. We've been talking to Professor Edgar Cahn, who is the founder of Time Banks. And so if Time Banks actually did have money, it would be Edgar's picture on it, I'm sure. But go to timebanks.org to get more information. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be right back after this.
Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph Nader, and we just completed a great interview with Professor Edgar Cahn. But now we're going to switch gears to something which I think is a little lighter. And Ralph, you wanted to talk about, I know you're a baseball fan. I'm not sure how much of a football fan you are, but all over the news this weekend was this pass interference call that was committed by the Dallas Cowboys, and it was obvious in all the replays that it was a pass interference call. They were playing the Detroit Lions in a wild card playoff game on Sunday. The referees threw a flag and then conferred and then picked up the flag and said it was no call, and all the replays defied that call. So there's a big conspiracy theory about all of that. What do you have to say about that, Ralph?
Well, it actually has a larger significance. The Lions were ahead 20-17. There were just 3 minutes or less in the game. The Lions had the ball. They were driving for a touchdown, but they were maybe 30, 40 yards away from the Dallas touchdown area. And the quarterback for the Lions went back for a pass, passed it in the direction of Brandon Pettigrew, went out as a tight end to catch the ball, and the Cowboy linebacker interfered with him. His name was Anthony Hitchens. So the referees threw the flag down, and the foul was supposed to be called. And then the referees huddled and then got out of the huddle and basically said, there's no foul. Now, everybody watching this game knew it was a clear pass interference, which would have been half the distance to the goal, first down, and they could have run out probably the clock and won and continued on the playoff. The entire season was at stake on this call. To make matters worse, a Dallas player who thought the call was going to go against Dallas rushes onto the field from the bench without his helmet. That is unsportsmanlike conduct, foul, and it wasn't called either. So the referees did not call 2 fouls that would probably won the game and saved the season for the lowly Detroit Lions against the All-American team that the Dallas Cowboys like to parade. So the question in the sports world is, was this really a mistake? Or was this in the recess of the referee's mind? He threw the yellow flag down, and then they had second thoughts. And here's where accusations of conspiracy theorists come in. What are the second thoughts? Well, it's just like that call between the Sacramento Kings and the LA Lakers a few years ago. The league likes to have big-name football teams reach the Super Bowl or reach the advanced playoff. Dallas is a big name. It draws big crowds. The Detroit Lions don't cut that mustard. And so the league, in effect, has an instant replay, but the instant replay does not apply to challenging the call for a penalty or no penalty. And so the entire season of the resurgent Detroit Lions went down the drain. And they have a very brainy coach, Jim Caldwell, for the Detroit Lions. He actually has his workers read books. He said it all. He said, quote, I do think in this day and age with modern times where we have technology that can take out the human factor in certain key situations in big games, that we should use that technology to do so, end quote. So they ought to amend the instant replay rule, the NFL, to include allowing coaches to ask for instant replay on this type of situation. And so I think there was a hidden kind of latent commercial factor here that maybe the referee would never admit to, of course, but it is strange that these season-ending or critical calls always go against the small city team or the small market team and in favor of the more flamboyant and the more audience-attracting teams.
So are you thinking that that's not an explicit conspiracy, but sort of an implicit one where there's some sort of tendency, or what do you mean?
It happens to referees. They were in Dallas, huge crowd, the season's on the line, and they could have made that the better part of valor was not to call the foul.
Well, in my reading, there have been studies done on home field advantage, and it does come down to the officiating. It's not that they're eating home cooking or sleeping in their own beds, or that the players are actually aroused by the crowd. It's that the referees are actually affected by the crowd, and that they, in our nature, is this sort of conformist tendency.
Yes. Steve, the answer to it is simple. Allow instant replay on these kinds of penalty calls.
I guess they don't do that because they're judgment. A lot of them are judgment calls, and they're a little hard to sort out, I guess. I don't know.
Anyway, that's that.
You surprised me because when I saw this on the topic list, I thought you were going to talk about bird watching. You were going to because I thought, oh, Ralph's going to say, why do people care so much about a silly football call when they should be concerned about rising airline fees or the consolidation of the cable industry? But I found it very surprising.
Commercialism and fear of audiences, in this case, the home field advantage and a roaring pro-Dallas crowd, are not minor things in cultures. And we have to point them out, even if they are in the area of sports entertainment and not in the area of political elections, where commercialism runs rampant.
This week we lost Mario Cuomo, who was governor of New York for 3 terms. Earlier, I quoted Robert F. Kennedy's poetic speech in 1968 when he was running for president. It was very poetic. Mario Cuomo said that politics is poetry, government is prose. Mario Cuomo was a poet. His speech in 1984 before the Democratic National Committee was poetry. He was not good at governing, but he was reelected 3 times. Do we sometimes just need poets who are politicians, even if they don't accomplish that much? Don't we need people who just inspire us with their words, even if they don't really accomplish anything?
Well, he did accomplish something. He was a fairly good governor, as governors go. But we do need poets. We need people we can quote. We need people who can inspire, lift our vision, reduce our cynicism, and withdrawal from the political process. When I write my condolence letter to Governor Andrew Cuomo, his son, I'm going to suggest that given all the supporters and admirers of Mario Cuomo, there's no reason why there shouldn't be established a Mario Cuomo Institute of Politics that would focus on engaging citizens in the political process. And I think we need to always urge that when well-known people pass away, like Nelson Mandela, that immediately there should be, in the period of grief and media attention, an opportunity to establish a permanent institution that reflects the values of the person who has passed away. That way, in a cumulative manner, you will increase the strength of a democratic society through these kinds of legacy institutions.
And his accomplishments as governor, can you point to some?
Yeah, well, he's very good on appointing minorities to positions where there never has been any minorities, such as high-level judicial appointments. He was pretty good on consumer protection. He was the leading opponent of the death penalty and very eloquent in that process. And I spent a couple of long sessions in his office talking to him about various things. And one of his last acts was to issue an order requiring inserts in bank statements that go to bank depositors and bank customers, inviting them to form their own watchdog groups over banks. And when Governor Pataki, who defeated Mario Cuomo's attempt for a 4th term, came into office, he literally burned the inserts that were in the warehouse ready to be put in New York State government mailings to millions of New Yorkers. Now, imagine if there were those watchdog groups run by bank consumers before the collapse of Wall Street. It might have been different.
Well, we began our session here today with a listener question. I think we have enough time to answer one more. And this one comes from Michael Damon. And Michael writes, I was watching one of the Nick channels with my sons, and a commercial came on for a really violent game that was rated M for mature. What is being done, if anything at all, to prevent this?
Well, this is a left-right issue that hasn't gone anywhere. That is, over 90% of the parents are appalled at the commercial marketing to kids. Junk food, junk drink, violent programming, goading kids to do things that are harmful to their health, their minds, and often to their friends on these violent programs. So to the questioner, I would say this: write a complaint to Nickelodeon, write a complaint to the stations that play this, and join with any number of parental groups that are trying to deal with over-commercialism of childhood. And I'm sure you'll be able to find them on Google, and they would like you to enlist your support in this effort. We need not to undermine parental authority over our children by commercial merchants who have no sense of restraint and, to be forthright about it, are able to be legitimately called electronic child molesters. Junk food, junk drink, violent programming, for starters. We have a book that came out in 1996 called Children First, and it documents the horrific exploitation of 4-year-olds, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10-year-olds, and then the addictive industries go after them in the preteen area. And when I read that book, it's an understatement as to what's going on today. In other words, it's getting worse, but there are left-right groups that are trying to do something about it.
Well, thank you, Michael Damon, for that question. And thank you, listeners, for both sending them in and listening to our episode today, which we have now come to the end of. I'm Steve Scrovan. On behalf of David Feldman and Ralph Nader, thank you for listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Join us again next week.
And thank you, Stephen and David. And listeners, go at it now.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell. Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.
Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice?